Mel Ignatow was arrested this morning at his Eastern Jefferson County home. He has been a major suspect in the Brenda Schaefer case since her disappearance in September of 1988. Her cause...
Mel Ignatow was a resident of Louisville, Kentucky, and was born on March 26, 1938, and murdered his girlfriend Brenda Sue Schaefer in 1988. The case was controversial because Ignatow was acquitted of the charge, but photographs that proved his guilt were uncovered after the trial. Under the legal principle of double jeopardy, however, Ignatow could not be tried a second time for the murder. He was, however, convicted and jailed for perjury in his grand jury testimony for the case on several occasions. Ignatow and Schaefer had been in a relationship for 2 years at the time of the murder. Still, Schaefer, who had complained that Ignatow was abusive, was planning to break off the involvement, an intention that Ignatow was aware of. Intending to murder Schaefer, he worked with a former girlfriend, Marianne Shore, to lay out plans for the murder, spending several weeks laying out extensive preparations. Shore testified they had scream-tested her house and dug a grave in the woods behind it. On September 23, 1988, Schaefer met Ignatow to return some jewelry of his that she had in her possession. Instead, Ignatow took Schaefer to Shore's house, where he pulled a gun on Brenda and locked her in the house. Brenda was blindfolded, gagged, and bound hand and foot. Ignatow forced Brenda to strip, photographed her in suggestive positions, raped, sodomized, and beat her before killing her with chloroform. Ignatow and Shore buried her behind Shore's house. He took Brenda's jewelry and the exposed film. Police suspected Ignatow almost immediately, but were unable to locate any witnesses or physical evidence linking him to Schaefer's disappearance, or even to locate Schaefer's body. In search for any lead that could let them move forward with the case, police invited Ignatow to clear his name by testifying before a grand jury. He mentioned Shore's name there, bringing her into the investigation for the first time. The police interviewed Shore, who eventually confessed to helping plan the murder, and to taking pictures of Ignatow as he tortured and abused Schaefer. Shore also led the investigators to the gravesite, where Brenda's badly decomposed body had been buried for over a year. The autopsy showed she had been abused, but any DNA evidence from blood and semen had decomposed. The investigators convinced Shore to wear a wire by promising only to charge her with tampering with evidence. In the surveillance, Shore told Ignatow that the FBI was hounding her, and she was afraid the property behind her house was being sold and developed. He was on tape berating her for letting the FBI rattle her, and told her he didn't care if they dug up the whole property because that place we dug is not shallow. With this damning piece of evidence in their hands, prosecutors brought Ignatow to trial for the murder in 1991. In court, however, the jury decided that one word on the tape was safe, not sight, as the police believed, which led them to conclude that the discussion involved a buried safe. Furthermore, Shore, the prosecution's star witness, wore a tiny miniskirt to court and laughed during her testimony, undermining her credibility in the eyes of the jury. The defense pointed out that Shore had killed Schaefer out of Ignatow. In light of these considerations, the jury acquitted Ignatow, although the judge was so embarrassed by this result that he wrote a letter of apology to the Schaefer family. However, 6 months after Ignatow's acquittal, a carpet layer working in Ignatow's old house found a plastic bag under the carpet containing the jewelry Schaefer had taken with her to return on the night of her disappearance. Police researched the house and discovered 3 rolls of undeveloped film in a heating duct. When developed, the film showed Ignatow torturing and raping Schaefer, just as Shore had described. Ignatow's face was not in the pictures, but body hair patterns and moles matched him perfectly. Ignatow was brought to trial for perjury in his grand jury testimony. Knowing that he could not be retried for the murder because of double jeopardy, Ignatow confessed in court at his perjury trial. He turned to Brenda's brothers in court and said that he had killed her, but that she had died peacefully. Ignatow served 5 years of an 8-year sentence for perjury. The state later prosecuted him on perjury charges in a case against Brenda's employer for threatening to kill Ignatow if he didn't tell where Brenda was. He was sentenced to 9 years for that perjury charge. Author Bob Hill wrote a book on the case called Double Jeopardy. This book became a top bestseller and provoked widespread interest in the case. Mel Ignatow was released from prison for the second time in December 2006. He returned, yet again, to Louisville, living in a home just a scant 4 miles from the house where he murdered Brenda Sue Schaefer. On September 1, 2008, Ignatow was found dead in his home. At the time of his death, Ignatow was 70 years old. An official cause of death has yet to be determined. However, based on initial remarks made by his upstairs neighbor who found Ignatow's body, and follow-up remarks given to the media by Ignatow's son, it is believed that Ignatow's death was due to an accidental fall that caused a laceration to either his head or his arm, and that he had eventually bled to death. He fell and hit a glass coffee table, and from what I can tell, he cut his arm, Ignatow's son stated. The upstairs neighbor, on the other hand, noted that it appeared Ignatow had cut his head and not his arm. It just looked like he had fallen and hit his head on the table, and he tried to go to the kitchen, and there was a blood trail that way. Then it looked like he wanted to make it to his room. Before he made it to his room, that's where they found his body. Ignatow's upstairs neighbor also described him as a sick and elderly man, alone and struggling for help when he stumbled to his death. I used to hear him all night, asking for Jesus to come get him because he was in a lot of pain. Ignatow's son admits that his father's sins may never be forgiven. He will probably go down as one of the most hated men in Louisville. He goes on to say that now he hopes his father's death will help people forget some of his transgressions. Maybe it'll just put it to rest so we all don't have to deal with this repeatedly. That's what I hope. Brenda Sue Schaefer was a 36-year-old woman in Louisville, Kentucky, who was murdered by Mel Ignatow in 1988. The case was controversial because Ignatow was acquitted of the charge. Later, photographs were found that proved his guilt, but he could never be charged again with Brenda's murder under the legal principle of double jeopardy. Friends described Brenda as a wonderful, sweet person but somewhat naive. Brenda had been Ignatow's girlfriend for 2 years, but she told others that he was physically and emotionally abusive. She told them she was afraid for her life and vowed to end the relationship. Ignatow knew she was going to leave. He and Marianne Shore, a former girlfriend, planned Brenda's torture and death for weeks. Shore testified they had scream-tested her house and dug a grave in the woods behind it. Ignatow took Brenda there, saying Shore wanted to see Brenda's jewelry. He then pulled a gun on Brenda and took her prisoner. Brenda was blindfolded, gagged, and bound, hand and foot. Ignatow took her to his secret lair in the trunk of his car. Ignatow forced Brenda to strip, photographed her in suggestive positions, raped, sodomized, and beat her before killing her with chloroform. Ignatow and Shore buried her behind Shore's house. He took Brenda's jewelry and the exposed film. Police zeroed in on the two immediately, but could not break them. Finally, they convinced Shore to wear a wire by promising only to charge her with tampering with evidence. She told Ignatow the FBI was hounding her, and she was afraid the property behind her house was being sold and developed. He was on tape, berating her for letting the FBI rattle her, and told her he didn't care if they dug up the whole property because that place we dug is not shallow. A bug is the common name for a covert listening device, usually a combination of a miniature radio transmitter and microphone. However, he mumbled the word dug, and the jury also thought he said the word safe instead of grave on the tape. So they thought they were talking about a buried safe with stolen items in it. They also did not believe Marianne Shore, who laughed during her testimony and was dressed in a miniskirt. She was over 200 lbs, with her legs crossed, almost revealing everything. The defense pointed to her as the killer, out of jealousy. This article can be confusing for some readers and needs to be edited for clarity. The badly decomposed body had not been found for over a year. The autopsy showed she had been abused, but any DNA evidence had decomposed. Rotting fruit decomposition is the reduction of bodies and other formerly living organisms into simpler forms of matter, and, most particularly, to the fate of the human body after death. The jury acquitted Ignatow. The state then filed perjury charges for his grand jury testimony. While awaiting this trial, the people who bought Ignatow's house while he was in jail recarpeted it. The carpet layer found a baggie in a heat duct under the carpet. It contained jewelry and 3 canisters of undeveloped film. The owners immediately turned the material over to the FBI. When the film was developed, it showed the torture and death of Brenda Sue Schaefer. Ignatow's face was carefully out of the pictures, but this body hair patterns and moles matched him perfectly. Perjury is lying or making verifiably false statements under oath in a court of law. A grand jury is a common law jury responsible for investigating alleged crimes, examining evidence, and issuing indictments. Knowing he could not be tried again because of double jeopardy, Ignatow confessed in court at his perjury trial. He had the nerve to turn to Brenda's brothers in court and say, yes, he killed her, but she died peacefully. Ignatow served 5 years of an 8-year sentence for perjury. The state later prosecuted him on perjury charges in a case against Brenda's employer for threatening to kill Ignatow if he didn't tell where Brenda was. He was sentenced to 9 years for that perjury charge. Author Bob Hill was so enraged by this case that he wrote a book called Double Jeopardy. This book became a top bestseller and provoked wide interest in the case. The man who admitted to killing his ex-girlfriend was sentenced to prison on Monday. Judge Stephen Ryan sentenced Mel Ignatow to 9 years on state perjury and persistent felon charges. Ignatow's attorney had asked the judge to set aside the verdict, saying that his client was a model citizen, but his request was denied. The judge also denied defense requests for a new trial and probation. Ignatow was acquitted of the 1988 murder of Brenda Sue Schaefer in 1991, then confessed to it the following year after photographs showing him torturing her were discovered. News Channel 32's Steve Bergen reported that Ryan called Ignatow evil at the time of the crime and said that evil people must suffer the consequences. It's come full circle, Mike Schaefer, Brenda Sue's brother, told Bergen. We're just glad to be here and get the result that we have. Bergen reported that if Ignatow serves the full sentence, he will be 72 years old when he gets out. Under further questioning, Marianne Shore cracked. She just flipped. She couldn't deal with it because the last time she'd seen Brenda Schaefer was during her murder. Shore cut a deal with prosecutors. She told them that Ignatow had sexually tortured and killed Brenda Schaefer in the Louisville home Shore was renting. Shore admitted she took part in the horrific abuse, even taking pictures of Ignatow with Schaefer, but claims she was not in the room for the actual murder. Marianne said she left the room when Ignatow murdered her, says Hill, whose book details the horrific torture. He had a bottle of chloroform and put chloroform over her mouth until she couldn't breathe anymore. Shore even led police to the body, buried in a grave in the woods behind Shore's house. Shore and Ignatow had allegedly dug the grave weeks before the murder. On January 10, 1989, 16 months after she disappeared, Brenda Schaefer's body was found, and Mel Ignatow was arrested. It took 2 years for Ignatow's trial to begin. Publicity forced a change of venue to Covington, Kai, a small community that knew little about the case. Marianne Shore was the prosecution's star witness. With no physical evidence linking Ignatow to Brenda's murder, Shore's testimony was crucial. She was a terrible witness, says Hill. She was poorly prepared. She wasn't ready and wore a short skirt that was hiked up here. Ignatow's attorney suggested a jealous Shore had killed Brenda Schaefer herself. The prosecution had one other piece of heavy ammunition, a tape recording of a conversation between Marianne Shore and Mel Ignatow. Before Ignatow was arrested, the FBI had wired Shore as the two of them discussed what they would do if the overgrown lot where Brenda was buried were sold to developers. He never really mentioned the act of murder or exposing the body, says investigator Wesley, but he certainly made incriminating statements that I thought would sway the jury. But then the jury wasn't swayed. Juror Greg Laukhoff says the importance of the tape all came down to one word. Was it safe? The key word, muffled on the tape, was in Ignatow's statement. It's not shallow, that place we dug, and it's not shallow, so don't let it get you rattled. Besides, that one area right by where that site is does not have any trees by it. We listened to that many, many, many times, and collectively, as a group, we could not decide what word that was, says Laukhoff. Ignatow was acquitted. Just like a thunderbolt, Hill says. People couldn't believe it. Ignatow's acquittal meant that only one person would be going to jail for the murder of Brenda Schaefer. Shore pled guilty to a lesser charge of evidence, tampering as part of her deal with prosecutors, and served a few years in jail. 6 months after Ignatow's trial ended, Steve Doherty was hired to rip out the carpeting in Ignatow's old house. I was just pulling it up, and then all of a sudden, I saw a Ziploc bag down there, Doherty recalls. The bag held some jewelry. The jewelry Brenda Schaefer was planning to return to Ignatow on the night she disappeared. Police, who had gone through the house twice before, returned a third time. They found the photographs in a heat duct in Ignatow's old house. These were the photos that Marianne Shore had taken, which showed Ignatow abusing and raping Brenda Schaefer. But there was a problem. Ignatow can never be charged with Brenda Schaefer's murder because of double jeopardy, the constitutional provision that protects citizens from being tried over and over again for the same crime. But he could be prosecuted for perjury in his grand jury testimony. And then, of course, being Ignatow, he turned on a dime, says Hill. After years of denying any involvement whatsoever, he tried to get a lesser plea because he'd cooperated with authorities. Ignatow described how he sexually tortured and murdered Brenda. And then, says Brenda's brother Mike, he turned around and looked at the family and said that she died peacefully. It was just pure Ignatow. Ignatow spent only 5 years in prison for perjury and was released. Unemployed and living on disability, he turned away a 48-hour camera crew and told a neighbor the media was trying to rehash an old story. But many people in Louisville fear that Ignatow could strike again. It would be awful, just awful, if Ignatow should happen to do this sort of thing to another woman, says Mike Schaefer. Determined to ensure justice, state prosecutors pressed new charges of perjury against Mel Ignatow, even though he had already served 5 years on federal charges of lying in court. In January, Ignatow was sentenced to 9 years on state perjury charges. In April, just 3 months into his sentence, he asked to be released on parole. The judge denied his request. While it once seemed Mel Ignatow would get away scot-free with the murder, prosecutors can take some measure of relief, knowing a dangerous killer is behind bars, at least for now. There is no mystery about who killed Brenda Schaefer. Everyone in Louisville, Kai, knows that Mel Ignatow did it. The mystery is why Ignatow is still a free man. It's a question that has consumed writer Bob Hill. The guy got away with murder, absolutely got away with murder, and 13 years later, he's still walking around getting away with murder, says Hill. A newspaper columnist for 26 years, Hill was so enraged by the murder that he wrote a book about it. Double Jeopardy. As Aaron Moriarty reports for 48 Hours, the story started on September 24, 1988, when 36-year-old Brenda Schaefer disappeared. Her car was found abandoned the next day, less than half a mile from where she lived with her mom and dad. I don't think our mother believed it, but we knew she was dead right away, says her brother Mike about himself and his brother Tom. Brenda's best friend, Joyce Basham, also feared the worst. Before she disappeared, Brenda had confided to Basham that she would break off the relationship with Ignatow, her boyfriend, and return all the jewelry he had given her. Ignatow claimed he had last seen Brenda at 11 the night before, when she left his house to drive home. But the family didn't buy the story and went to the Jefferson County Police. Detective Jim Wesley was in charge of the Violent Crimes Unit. Wesley's suspicions were aroused as soon as he met Ignatow. He was calling me Jim, and he was calling me Jim, like, "You're my buddy, Jim." And I'm saying to myself, "I'm not this man's buddy, and this man has done something," Wesley recalls. Ignatow was the image of success. He drove a Corvette, owned a 32-foot pleasure boat, and lived in an affluent part of town. He was a work of art, Mike Schaefer says of Ignatow. "I tell you, this guy told such outlandish lies and stories to impress people, and no one believed him." According to police, Ignatow fits the profile of what is called a criminal sexual sadist, someone who is aroused by the suffering of another. At the time of Brenda's disappearance, Roy Hazelwood was an investigator with the FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit and a leading authority on sexually deviant criminals. Louisville authorities called in Hazelwood for help in better understanding their lead suspect. "You don't break up with someone like Mel Ignatow," Hazelwood says. "Mel Ignatow breaks up with you, but you don't break up with Mel. And I think he made up his mind to kill her, and so he decided to make it as enjoyable as possible to him in the way he killed her." Without a body, the police had only suspicions. After 9 or 10 months, Ignatow seemed to flaunt his untouchability, never shying away from the cameras that followed him. U.S. Attorney Scott Cox devised a plan to use Ignatow's own thirst for positive publicity against him. Cox asked Ignatow to voluntarily testify before a federal grand jury to clear his name, and Ignatow went for the bait, fully aware that authorities could use any incriminating statements against him if he slipped. He volunteered to testify before a grand jury, which is just nuts, says Arthur Hill. But the move came as no surprise to FBI behavioral expert Hazelwood. "I call narcissism the Achilles heel of the sexual offender," he says. "They think they are so superior to society in general and law enforcement in particular that, yeah, I know they are going to be attracted to me, but that's going to be kind of exciting." In his testimony, Ignatow mentioned an old girlfriend named Mary Ann Shore. Police began to question Shore and called her in to testify before the grand jury. Shore testified that she'd seen Brenda Schaefer once, but when asked about Brenda's looks, Shore said, "You mean the last time I saw her?" When the discrepancy was pointed out, Shore fled the grand jury room. After all the lies and failed parole hearings, Mel Ignatow is free, serving his time. He got away with murder, but couldn't. Dodged 2 perjury convictions later. After serving his second short prison term, Mel Ignatow is on the loose, released from prison Friday morning, probably for the final time. He's arguably the most notorious and reviled criminal in Louisville history, the guy who got away with the murder of Brenda Sue Schaefer. But Mel Ignatow did do 2 prison stints, both for perjury after being acquitted of Schaefer's murder. Today, Ignatow's a free man, released from an eastern Kentucky prison after serving about half a 9-year sentence. I felt a sense of relief that maybe this is the final chapter of a long story that has been burdensome for this whole community. That's Charlie Ricketts, who successfully defended Ignatow against the murder charge and got word Friday that his former client is again a free man. "Is he a danger?" "No, I don't think so," says Ricketts. "If he were somewhere else and fell into some old habit, then there might likely be such a danger. But as long as we know who he is and what he is, I don't think there's any danger." "I genuinely believe he is still dangerous," says prosecutor Scott Cox. And Adeline Spaulding, the widow of Dr. William Spaulding, Brenda Sue Schaefer's boss, and the man who was convicted of threatening Ignatow, says she was stunned when she got a letter over the weekend saying the man who lied at her husband's trial was going to be freed. "Just a wonderful Christmas present," she says. "I'm upset about getting the news when I didn't expect it. There wasn't anything I could do about it." Adeline Spaulding says she's not afraid of Ignatow, but wishes he was still behind bars.